Is creatine really worth the hype? Over the last year, it's made this giant resurgence. And people throw around research from 50 years ago, from 30 years ago, with 4 people, with 9 people. No, I want the big data. Show me the real science here on creatine. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, there's over 500 different studies that have been done in terms of creatine on muscle size, on muscle strength, on exercise physiology. The problem that we've always faced is that they're in very isolated situations. And we've seen over the years that, creatine is one of the most studied ergogenic aids, and that it's very, very helpful when it comes down to improving strength and muscle mass. But we need to understand the bigger picture. And over the last 2 years, in 2022, 2023, there's been some big reviews that have come out, big meta-analysis, big studies that look at lots of different clinicals so that we can get a bigger picture. Now, there's one very big myth that we need to address first before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how much you need, if it's really effective, what you should do. And that is the simple myth that creatine is sort of an ergogenic aid that's like a steroid. And what I mean by that is creatine is not something that you take in that is going to make you perform above and beyond like natural abilities. There's no super physiological thing that is happening. Okay, you cannot fill up your creatine stores more than what they naturally could be filled with from food. Okay, so it's not this exogenous aid. You're just boosting your own stores. Now, the other big thing we have to address is it is 100% not a muscle building supplement. It is an energy boosting supplement that certainly can have a muscle building effect because you have more energy and potentially more strength. But creatine is there to help you manufacture energy, to give you energy. Okay, it is not there to literally just help you build muscle. So for concerned parents out there, for people that are just not wanting to add it in, that's not the drill. It helps you create energy. The best way to explain creatine is explaining it like a battery. Okay, it's a battery that provides you with energy until your body can start using glucose or glycogen or fat from your own stores or from your own system. It's like when you start a car, you are starting a car from the power of the battery. And then once the car is running, the alternator kicks in, starts charging the battery, and things are running from the internal combustion engine, and that's kind of fueling the battery, ultimately creating that circuit that way. That's exactly how creatine is working. It's not your direct energy. It is something that you pull from. And the way that it works is you kind of have this constant bridge going where you have ATP being created and you have creatine donating energy that's happening at like a micro level all the time, but we really feel it like in the first few reps of exercise or in the first few seconds of a sprint. Okay, so visualize it like this. Okay, you have what is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is ultimately the energy currency in our body. Okay, we create energy and ATP is that energy. Now there are 3 phosphate molecules on ATP, adenosine triphosphate, 1, 2, 3. When we create energy and we actually need to move our body, we take one of these phosphate molecules away and cleave it off. And we're left with ADP. That phosphate molecule was used to perform. Now what happens is you have creatine phosphate, stores of phosphate that are with creatine, and that donates that phosphate molecule. So that's the best way to show it. You have this constant donating, release, donating. And that's really how creatine works. Let's talk about getting creatine from the diet for a second. Because do we get enough from the diet? That's the big question. We're gonna find it in salmon and red meat, not so much in chicken, poultry, things like that. Usually red meat and salmon. It's usually about 1 to 3 grams per day that's required from the diet per se. And unfortunately, based upon the research, we're getting about half of that. So we're usually falling pretty short. There's about 1 to 2 grams of creatine in a pound of salmon or red meat. Okay, so it's hard for us to get it from our food. Now, the remainder is made up from the liver and from the kidneys. But this is highly, highly individual. For example, you might create a lot endogenously from your liver and kidneys, and maybe I don't, or maybe vice versa, right? It's all over the map. So it's really hard to determine who's deficient or who's getting enough creatine. But the simple bottom line is that we're not typically getting enough from our diet. So that begs the question, should we supplement or should we try to get more meat in? What should we really do? Well, there's a study that was published in the journal Amino Acids that took a look at an omnivorous diet, and they found that on average, people that are eating vegetables and meat and just an omnivorous diet were getting about 0.75 to 1.5 grams of creatine in per day from their diet. That's really not that much. So how much should you take? Well, for general health, if you're going to supplement creatine, it's more like 2 to 3 grams if you're just looking to maintain, feel good, have more energy. If you're looking for more muscle building, you're looking more in the world of 4 to 6, 4 to 7 grams per day. This 15, 20 gram stuff really doesn't seem to add any additional benefit. Although there's not a whole lot of drawback either, you're just not getting a lot of benefit above 5, 6, 7 grams of creatine per day. We're gonna go into some detail. I wanna talk about strength, I wanna talk about muscle, I wanna talk about endurance, I wanna talk about cognition for older populations, and I definitely wanna talk about the drawbacks. Okay, the drawbacks are important. So we're gonna get to those drawbacks shortly in this video. But I put a link down below for a company called Create that has these creatine monohydrate gummies. Super convenient because they're in 1 gram gummy form. So normally, if you're taking creatine, you have a scoop of powder. It's kind of a mess to deal with, and you get a 5 gram serving. This makes it really nice because you can accurately dose. So you can take 1 gummy and get 1 gram of creatine. If you're just, Sally that wants to hey, feel better as a stay-at-home mom, take 1 or 2 grams, right? You don't need a muscle building dose, right? But if you're, I don't know, Jill or Bob that say, hey, I want to go to the gym and I want to work hard and build muscle, then maybe you can take 5 of those gummies, right? It's really convenient that way. That's a 20% off discount link if you use code TDL20 at that link. So 20% off your entire order. Okay, it makes it so that super convenient and they get delivered to your doorstep. And if you want, there's a subscription model as well. The whole idea behind Create is to really stop the stigma behind creatine because unfortunately it has been stigmatized. It's been stigmatized as a steroid, as this heavy ergogenic aid, as a muscle building supplement, and that's the wrong stigma. It is an energy supplement and it helps you feel better and feel more alert and feel more energized. So we really want to stop the stigma there. It's totally non-GMO, it's completely vegan friendly, so it's very, very easy to add into your life. The best part is it's third-party tested, so you're getting good quality stuff. And as a matter of fact, 80% of customers claim that they notice body composition changes in as quickly as 6 weeks. So that's really, really cool stuff. So anyway, that link is down below, top line of the description, right underneath this video. Definitely recommend you give them a shot. Just makes it easy, convenient, super easy to travel with. My wife takes them, I take them, it's easy. Let's jump ahead to a safety thing really quick. There was a study that took a look at 20 to 30 grams of creatine per day for up to 5 years with no adverse effects. So I want people to understand that. But when we look at the evidence-based research, we find that the sweet spot does seem to be between 3 to 5 grams per day. Okay, 1 to 2 grams for a mild nootropic brain effect, 3 to 5 grams per day when you start looking for more of that physical energy effect. There was also a study that was published in Frontiers in Nutrition that did demonstrate that it's safe for adolescents. And I wanted to mention that because as a parent myself, I look at this kind of stuff. I don't know if I would want my kid just taking any random pre-workout that's out on the market. But people have the concern of, okay, creatine being a gateway drug, to other ergogenic aids or steroids or anything like that. And I think as long as the proper education is there, that's not a concern. But as far as safety, the research is there that it is safe for teenagers as well. I want to dive into the strength piece. This is how creatine actually works, and also the evidence that shows how it is so darn effective at getting us stronger. So we look at a newer paper that was published in 2022. This was a review paper published in Nutrients where they looked at lots of different clinicals and they looked at varying dosages of creatine as well as varying physical activity. They found in as little as 2 weeks of an 8-week resistance training regimen, there were dramatic increases in strength with just mild creatine supplementation. And that increased all the way through the 8 weeks. By 8 weeks, they were getting even stronger. Now, additionally, what they demonstrated is in other studies, Brazilian soccer players that were adding creatine into the mix were getting stronger in their lower body, whereas rowers and canoeists were getting stronger in their upper body. And my reason for saying this is it's very fascinating that there was no specific additional training being done. So it's not like Brazilian soccer players were taking creatine and then doing 10 extra sets of squats, or canoers weren't doing, an extra 10 sets of pendlay rows or something. They were flat out doing their normal training and getting stronger in that continuum, which is so unbelievably cool and shows how creatine is just so naturally useful. Now, a big bummer for a lot of people, but it's important to note. The muscle mass that you get from creatine is not from the creatine. There was a brand new paper that just came out in 2023 that demonstrated this pretty clear. It looked at muscle fiber size, and they found that the muscle fiber size, the increase, came from the strength that came from the creatine, not from the creatine itself. However, there was a small increase in muscle size, but it's just not much, which is kind of cool though, because they looked at people that were not training given creatine. Now, what could be happening in some cases is you do have an increase in muscle cell volume, at least in the very beginning, because creatine is loaded into the muscle via a sodium-dependent transporter, which means whenever sodium is coming in, you're gonna have this like osmotic state. You're gonna have water come in as well, which means in the beginning especially, you might retain some water inside the muscle, which is going to create the illusion of bigger muscles immediately. And if you were to do just baseline scans or older scans, you would say, hey, I have more muscle. But the newer data, when we actually look at muscle cross-sectional area and we see this stuff, we see, wait a minute, no, the muscle fiber itself isn't growing until there is stimulus. The thing is that creatine makes us better at achieving that stimulus. It makes us stronger, and therefore we can build bigger muscle. Now, there are some other really cool mechanisms, and this also doubles as the ability to potentially lower glucose. Okay, let me explain something. We have glycogen, stored carbohydrates in our muscle, okay? And when the carbohydrates are stored in our muscle, they actually allow us to create ATP faster. They can improve ATP turnover. And what ends up happening is the more carbohydrates we have stored, the faster we can replenish energy during our workout. What's interesting is we are now seeing evidence that creatine can increase GLUT4 translocation and the amount of GLUT4. What does that mean? That means creatine can help you soak up carbohydrates into the muscle easier, which means that you're gonna have more muscle glycogen, which means that independent of the creatine giving you energy, you're going to have more carbohydrate energy in your muscle, which is great because that means you're gonna be able to go further, train harder, train longer. Okay, very fascinating, but in addition to that, you're also lowering your blood sugar, which could be very beneficial for a lot of the population that's dealing with insulin resistance and those kinds of issues. Now, there's also some evidence now that creatine has an effect on calcium reuptake. It alters calcium reuptake, which means that it's changing how fast actin and myosin crossbridge can form. What does that mean in human terms? It basically means when a muscle contracts and relaxes at a micro level, we are able to have that happen at a faster turnover. And that means harder contractions, faster contractions. For like a sprinter, it's beyond just having energy. It's about how fast are we able to contract, relax when we're sprinting, right? Well, that's cool and all, but what about the downside, right? Like, isn't creatine bad for the kidneys? Isn't creatine gonna cause these other problems? First off, I haven't seen any legitimate evidence that suggests that creatine is actually bad for the kidneys. Creatine maybe is bad for the kidneys if you're taking creatine and you're super dehydrated, but that's a completely moot point. That has nothing to do with the actual creatine itself. As a matter of fact, we're now starting to see evidence that creatine is a powerful antioxidant. We're just trying to understand the mechanism. What's interesting is when you exercise hard, you need antioxidants, and you need natural antioxidants. Creatine seems to increase the natural antioxidant capability of our body, and it probably does this by aiding in the mitochondria, by allowing our energy powerhouses to manufacture energy better. It takes the stress off of the body to create energy, so the body can neutralize the free radicals that cause us harm. We still need a lot of research to be done, but this is fascinating. That's potentially an antioxidant. What about older people? First of all, seems to be absolutely safe in older people. But if we look at that Frontiers in Nutrition study from 2023, we see that older populations get a huge mental benefit. Why? Well, because energy is needed in our brain too. We think about energy in our muscle. What about mitochondria and energy in our brain? Well, if we're actively using our brain, we're pulling from those creatine stores all the time. And as we get older, maybe we're struggling a little bit more and we need more of it. So it's a great use case for people that are maybe over 40, over 50, start to notice that cognitive decline and memory loss. Endurance, this is kind of funny because there has been a lot of research over the last 20 years trying to justify creatine for endurance use. The bottom line is that it's very difficult to measure. Endurance work is different because endurance work, you do not have defined rest periods where creatine can sort of restore. Creatine needs to restore. That's why if you're training heavy weights, You have long rest periods between your sets, so creatine can restore, so glycogen kind of resynthesize a little bit, right? But if you're doing endurance work, this is happening at a very minute level, and the rests are not the normal rests. They're happening when you don't even realize it. You know, a slight downhill, a slight period where you're not in oxygen debt and you can restore. Very difficult to measure these minute rests. So first of all, it's difficult to understand in the first place. Second of all, the contribution of creatine to endurance work is probably minimal. However, where we are seeing creatine beneficial for endurance work is its ability to neutralize and reduce the inflammation. Okay, endurance work beats the heck out of our bodies. It is hard on our bodies as far as inflammation is concerned. Huge increases in C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interferon, all these things. Okay, and a lot of it has to do with the gut damage that occurs. We end up causing gut damage when we do large bouts of endurance work. Creatine helps blunt this. In fact, there was a study published in Amino Acids that took Ironman triathletes, gave them a major dose, 20 grams of creatine per day for 5 days before an Ironman triathlon. They found that those that had the creatine had significant reductions in inflammation. IL-6, tumor necrosis factor, also significant reductions in interferon. Their immune system was not overactive and they were in a calm state, right? So their body was able to recover. This, my friends, is why it could be beneficial. There's also the potential cell hydration aspect. If your cells are hydrated, you can perform longer. And since creatine does potentially draw water into the muscle cell, that's a big deal. From the cognitive side, let's say you don't even care about working out. You just want cognitive performance. Well, again, we jump back to that 2023 nutrition review study. Older populations, the older that someone gets, the more benefit they get from creatine. Why does this matter even if you're young? Well, what it tells us is that the more metabolic mitochondrial damage that you have in your brain, the better you're gonna have an impact from creatine. Now, additionally, if we look at this, if you are metabolically deranged and you are insulin resistant, which unfortunately a lot of people are even when they're young, the mitochondria in your brain are not functioning properly. But if you can provide them with creatine as an additional fuel, this could be huge. So we notice cognitive function, that's why we're seeing it used as a nootropic all the time. But now we're starting to see potential neuroprotective effects, like actually preventing or potentially preventing neurodegenerative conditions from occurring. There was one study in particular that found that there was potential protection against nitropropionic acid influx. So basically this toxicity that occurs in the brain from this buildup of this one particular toxin. Now this is a small isolated situation, but we're seeing it replicated in rodents and we're seeing it replicated in vitro too. So creatine doesn't just provide our energy for our brain, but it also has a protective effect as well. I promised you I'd talk about the cons. We need to address this. This is a serious thing that we should all be paying attention to. The first drawback, okay, this is going to be the water retention. If you start taking creatine, people claim that they're puffy. They start noticing that they get puffy and it makes them feel soft and they don't really like it. This could be a very real thing, and it's being investigated because it's kind of confusing. The reality is that creatine does require a sodium transport to get into a cell, so it would make sense from this osmotic effect that we would have an increase in water. However, that water should all be intracellularly in the muscle and not subcutaneous. So you shouldn't get puffy. If anything, you should get volumized and your muscles would look fuller. So the first thing we have to look at is what else is on your creatine label? Okay, because a lot of times there's other things in there that might be making you retain water, and it's not just the creatine. Secondly, most of the research suggests that any fluid retention that does occur is A, in the muscle, but B, temporary, as your body starts to restore and your body starts to kind of develop its use for it and understanding this full store, where it can sort of has a stronger affinity for getting it right into the muscle. The other thing we have to look at is the non-responder side. And this isn't so much of a con, but based upon some newer research in 2023, we're seeing that there's about 20% of people that are actually creatine non-responders. Now, the caveat here is that even with a non-responder, they still get a benefit. They just don't respond to the rest of the benefits like the 80% do. Now, what this means is that when you take creatine, you're just not going to get the same effect. But why is this happening? What makes a non-responder? What the studies are starting to help us illustrate or understand is that when someone doesn't produce a lot of creatine endogenously by the liver and kidneys, they have adapted to being able to be better off with lower levels of creatine. So when you add creatine in, their body has already developed an adaptation to not use it as much. That being said, we can always potentially overcome this adaptation by giving more creatine so the body starts to learn how to use it more. But your body is just doing what it's doing by saying, hey, you don't produce a lot of creatine, let's get better with low amounts. So you're gonna be in a non-responder category. However, you're still gonna respond. It's not like it's completely null. It's just an important thing to note. Okay, what about the hair loss side? This comes from a study that was published on some rugby athletes a while back, where it found that creatine increased DHT, and this DHT conversion ultimately can lead to hair loss, just like taking anabolic steroids. First of all, this was one study out of over 500 that's really demonstrating this. And any potential increase in DHT, A, would have to come from a copious amount, but B, is more than likely going to be bound up in sex hormone binding globulin. I mean, even testosterone. Testosterone has such a strong affinity, right? So when DHT is elevated, the fact that creatine is going to drive this up, most of that DHT is going to get bound up by sex hormone binding globulin and by other compounds within the body. It's only the free DHT that would ever cause hair loss. So you really do need exogenous hormones to trigger DHT levels to be so high that they cause hair loss. So this could have been a situation where maybe these rugby players had exogenous testosterone and we don't really know this situation. And then of course we have the kidney piece, but that isn't really a con anymore. People are also going to say, what about my creatinine levels? Creatinine is only going to be increased when you are breaking down the muscle and actually have more muscle. If you have exponential amounts of creatinine, you do need to consult with your doctor. But we have not seen this in the creatine literature, that it's going to drive up creatinine. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I hope this served as a complete guide to creatine today. I'll see you tomorrow.